Thank you, everyone, for that, and I'm really, really thankful that I got here on time. I want to thank the collaborators and funders of this work. And I want to first just put into context what I'll be speaking about today, which are racial and ethnic disparities in cognitive aging. Disparities are differences in outcomes, health outcomes, that, and the reason why we use the word disparities instead of differences is that factors in the causal pathway would change if race or ethnicity would change, if you could change that. These factors are rooted in social inequity or injustice. Other factors, like genetic factors that are not rooted in social inequity, could contribute to differences in cognitive aging across populations, but not have that term disparity. And the reason why we're interested in disparities is that they can reveal pathways to disease or to cognitive impairment in this case. And because there are so many different possible pathways to disease, an interdisciplinary approach is critical for work on disparities. There can be environmental, social, biological, or behavioral pathways to disparities in cognitive function. And Maria Gleamore and I tried to kind of put this down in a model that tries to make this case where over the life course, these factors interact with each other. So early in childhood, distal socially pattern mediators like family and socioeconomic position, or geographic location where you grew up, lead to perhaps individual mediators of disparities in cognitive aging, like how cognitively engaged people are or individual stressors they have, which interact with proximal mediators like health behaviors or access to medical care, all to influence disparities in cognitive aging. So what's the evidence for disparities in cognitive function and cognitive aging? These data are taken from a longitudinal cohort. They're both regional and national studies that have found evidence for disparities. And this is from the Washington Heights, Inwood, Hamilton Heights Aging Project. It's a longitudinal study, and found that at all age groups, African Americans and Hispanics who were not demented at baseline were more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease over the course of follow-up. This is a cross-sectional study of the Health and Retirement Survey. They defined cognitive impairment using a brief telephone battery and found that African Americans and Hispanics, again at all age groups, were at higher risk for having prevalent cognitive impairment. And then most recently, this study in the Kaiser Permanente Northern California cohort, which is a large integrated healthcare delivery system, found that African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives were at higher risk of developing dementia as compared to the lowest risk group, which were Asian Americans in that cohort. And all of the ethnic groups in this cohort had high risk of developing dementia over the life course, but there were ethnic differences in average age of onset. So I want to talk about a couple of issues before I get into mechanisms of disparities, and one of them is that when the studies I just showed you had dichotomous outcomes, impairment, non-impaired, demented, not demented, and follow-up. But when you look at longitudinal data, the first thing that you see when you compare whites, who are in the red line here, compared to blacks, who are in the blue line, and Hispanics are in the gray line, is that the effect of race on intercept is much larger than the effect of race on slope, even though there's a significant effect of race on change over time in these data, where a memory composite score on our battery, this is from YCAP, is on the y-axis here. So intercept race has a much bigger effect on intercept, but when any diagnostic threshold is set, that really would, intercept differences have a significant impact. If everybody's declining at about the same rate, the blacks and Hispanics are going to hit that diagnostic threshold earlier. So another issue in terms of methodological considerations when looking at disparities is survival bias. The people who live to be studied, who are African American, are on average much hardier than the people who live to be studied who are white at older ages. So this can exaggerate or reverse the effect of predictors on any dichotomous outcome. Mortality is one of them, but dementia is another dichotomous outcome. And Laura Zahadny looked at this in both the MIDAS study, which is a midlife cohort, and the YCAP study, which I described a little bit earlier as a Northern Manhattan study. And she used cross-sectional data and showed that disparities in episodic memory, which is the outcome here, were narrower in the oldest half of each cohort as compared to the younger half of each cohort. So this suggests that any predictors that you're looking at have a differential relationship with your cognitive outcome across race. Adam Berkman has been spearheading studies on imaging in the YCAP cohort and found that African Americans and Hispanics have more white matter hyperintensities on average than do whites. Now, this is age on the x-axis, so you're not born with white matter hyperintensities, so we're missing the midlife point at which these lines diverge. And using those data, Laura Zahadny and Adam Berkman found that white matter hyperintensities were related to cognitive outcomes among African Americans, but not among whites. In contrast, hippocampal volume was related to incident dementia among whites, but not among blacks. So these findings suggest there are different possible pathways and contributors of some of these imaging variables to later life cognitive function and disparities. There's been a lot of emphasis on ancestry and as a possible biological mediator of disparities. So if African Americans are at higher risk of developing dementia, maybe there's something about African ancestry that puts you at higher risk, or genetic factors that put you at higher risk. So researchers have been looking at the relationship of ancestry to these cognitive outcomes and found that African Americans with higher levels of African ancestry, both whole genome and also at specific local regions, were at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But the problem with this study is that they weren't able to take into account social factors that in fact correlate very well with African ancestry and could confound that relationship. Jess Martin and colleagues looked in the Health and Retirement Survey, comparing the highest versus the lowest quartile of people with African ancestry, and found that that people with higher African ancestry had fewer years of education, their parents had fewer years of school, they were less likely to have received an inheritance, they had lower income, and less wealth than African Americans at the highest or the lowest level of African ancestry. So of course, ancestry is not the mediator between race and these factors, but it's probably a really good marker for individual social experiences and also the social experiences of your parents and grandparents. And this has been found to explain the relationship between diabetes and, or the relationship between ancestry and diabetes and other cohorts. So we're also looking, as Liz mentioned, at schooling as a mediator of disparities in Alzheimer's disease and cognitive function. we found that in the Health and Retirement Survey, the size of disparities depended on region in which you were born and educated. So if you're looking at overall cognitive status, memory, or vocabulary outcomes, people who were born and raised in the South, there were wider disparities between whites and blacks compared to those who were born, say, in the Midwest or Northeast. We found that the state in which you went to school and also a proxy for school quality, which is reading level, explained racial differences in cognitive function, that it also explains racial differences in cognitive decline, that people with lower reading level or poorer quality of school have faster decline on memory measures. And we also found that, I'm sorry that this is so small, but the story is that racial differences in incidence of Alzheimer's disease are explained by this proxy for school quality that we used a reading level measure. We're also interested in behavioral mediators or psychosocial mediators of disparities. And as an example, Laura Zahodny looked at the ACTIVE trial, an intervention in which African Americans benefited less from abstract reasoning training than did whites. But this effect was completely explained by external locus of control. So African Americans with higher external locus of control had less benefit from the training than African Americans who had lower external locus of control, whereas there was no effect of locus of control among whites. So in conclusion, I am done. There's a big sign that says done right in front of me. There are racial disparities that are not attributable to assessment bias. I want to note something that Liz mentioned. Clinic-based cohorts are not appropriate for studies of disparities because of the selection bias coming into clinics. We have examined biological, environmental, and sociocultural mediators. It looks to me like school quality is a really important one and represents an early life course effect, and interdisciplinary approaches are necessary for determination of causal mechanisms of disparities. Thank you.